Hello and welcome to the video. I reckon there are 236 countries in the world, and I made a video in which I explained how I came to that total. You can find it here and also down in the description. Out of those, I've been to 113. Making that video made me think about the countries that I've been to that I'm most keen to go back to, and also those that I'm probably least keen to see again. And of the countries I haven't been to, which ones are top of my list and which ones are going to be at the bottom. So that's 24 countries in total, and today I'm going to talk about the ones that I've been to that I'm most keen to return to. So stick around.
Hi, I'm Matt. Over the last 25 years, I've travelled a lot. I've lived in 5 countries on 4 continents. I've flown over 1.3 million miles. I've visited over 100 countries, every American state, but I'm nowhere near done. So hit subscribe to see where I go next and perhaps get some inspiration for your next trip.
Before we get to the first country, out of the 4 videos, this was the hardest one to plan. Out of the 113 I've been to, picking just 6 that I most want to go back to was really tough. I found it hard to pick the 6 countries I was least keen to visit, and I'm not convinced I got that right. Check out that video and leave me a comment as to whether you agree or not. That leaves 107 countries to pick from, and pretty much any of them could have featured on this list. So I'll cheat a little bit and I'll give a shout out to 4 additional countries later on, which will take this list to 10 in total. So number 1 on my list is Israel. Israel was one of the last new countries I went to before the current shenanigans shut down international travel, but I enjoyed it so much that it's on the list of places that I want to go back to. I went for 5 nights in February 2019 and stayed in Jerusalem for the entire time. I made the mistake of thinking that the Middle East is hot, right? Well, it isn't. So I ended up wearing pretty much all the clothes I took with me every time I left the hotel. Jerusalem felt like a city best explored in heat and humidity, although I did find some decent weather for my trip up to the Temple Mount. I'm not a religious person, to say the least, but I am fascinated by religions, and Jerusalem is an all-you-can-eat buffet of religious history. There are so many stories I could tell from my visit, but I'll restrict myself to the one that I enjoy most, the story of the immovable ladder. A ladder was placed under a window at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1728, and it hasn't been moved again since 1757. There's a long-standing agreement that all 6 Christian orders present in the city need to agree before alterations are made to any property in the city. And they haven't agreed on what to do with the ladder, meaning that it hasn't moved for 263 years. Simultaneously, a piece of living history, but also an example of how silly organised religion can be sometimes. I took a tour of the West Bank, visiting places familiar to biblical scholars and news followers, such as Ramallah, Bethlehem and Jericho, and all of them are fascinating. But there's plenty more to see of this fascinating country, not least Tel Aviv, which I missed out entirely on my trip. I'd quite happily spend another 5 days in Jerusalem, but I'd probably go between May and September when it's a little bit less frostbitey. A final note on safety, which I know is a deterrent for a lot of people thinking of visiting the country. It's undoubtedly a troubled part of the world, possibly less so in the last few years. There was a strong military presence just about everywhere that I went, but the communities there have coexisted for 2,000 years or more, and on the streets people did seem to get along, probably because they have to, and over the years they've learned how to. Exercise the usual caution, but Israel is open for tourism, and tourism does play an important role for all of the communities in the country. So don't let security issues deter you from going and visiting this amazing and historic place. So that's number 1, Israel. Number 2 is Kyrgyzstan. I went to Kyrgyzstan in February 2015, having spent a few days in Kazakhstan. I'll save the full story for another video, but some friends and I went through a phase of going and watching ice hockey matches in unusual places. So after seeing a couple of matches in Astana, or Nur Sultan as it's now known, we flew to Almaty and tacked on a couple of days in Bishkek because it was only a 4-hour drive away. February again, so it was deep winter. Any return visit I make will certainly be when it's a little more clement. Bishkek was fascinating, made more so by the fact that it hasn't made much of an effort to delete its Soviet history. Kyrgyzstan was part of the Soviet Union until 1991, and whilst many of the former republics have distanced themselves from their Soviet history, but Kyrgyzstan hasn't. It's quite hard to tell whether that is because of ideology, politics, economics, or just lethargy. The best example of this was the State History Museum, which was a remarkable time capsule of Soviet days. I gather that the building is currently closed for renovation with no set date for reopening, which may indicate that history is actually finally being addressed. Close by are statues of Lenin, Marx, Engels, lots and lots of red stars. It really is an interesting place to go and explore. Bishkek was home to a US airbase for many years, so English is more widely spoken than you might expect for a Central Asian country. It's a developing country, so there were a few challenges, not least of which was an interaction with the local police that was a bit interesting. But fortunately, we knew to carry our passports with us rather than just copies, so we were fine. The countryside is probably the place's biggest draw, with lakes and mountains the equal of Switzerland, only not perhaps in February. As I said at the start, it was very difficult to narrow this down to just the 6 countries, so I decided not to include any of the 5 countries that I've actually lived in. I'll make a separate video about those a bit later on. But I have included one country that has quite a lot in common with one of the countries that I did live in. So number 3 on the list is New Zealand. I first went to NZ in February 1996. Those of you taking notes will see that that's my 3rd February debut in a row. At least this time it was the Southern Hemisphere, so it was a bit warmer. I stayed in Auckland for a couple of days and made a day trip to Rotorua. When I moved to Australia in 1999, I had a job that included responsibility for New Zealand, so I went across the ditch a number of times, although always just to Auckland. I think New Zealand is on a lot of people's travel wish lists, and it stays on a lot of Europeans' travel wish lists because it's such a long way away. So I probably don't need to spend that long explaining why it's on my list. The land of the long white cloud presents itself as being welcoming, friendly, outdoorsy, and having been there a fair few times, I know that that's all true. I'd love to see the capital, Wellington. I'd love to tour the wineries, and almost all of the Southern Island is just jaw-droppingly gorgeous. It's an uncontroversial choice. Some might say it's even a bit of a dull choice, but I have to include it. New Zealand. Right, let's get off the mainstream tourist beat a little more with country number 4, Cambodia. I've only been to Cambodia once, for 4 days in October 2004, as part of a wider Indochina tour offered by Explore Worldwide. For the record, I remain unremunerated for endorsements of Explore Worldwide. We flew into Phnom Penh, took a boat up the Tonle Sap as far as we could towards Siam Reap, and then spent a couple of days at Angkor Wat. I almost moved to Phnom Penh in 1996 as part of the pre-opening team of a major hotel there. A lot happened in the 8 years between 96 and 04, and I'd love to see what's happened in the 16 years since. 16 years! Cambodia has one of the most distressing recent histories you can imagine, and visiting the killing fields and other sites of significance around Phnom Penh is not an easy touristic experience. You can't help but contrast the horrors that you're seeing with the optimism and friendliness of the people. Then you visit Angkor Wat and see the strength and power of the region's civilization in the 12th century. And you really do feel a desire to help the country get back on its feet, something that your tourist dollars and reals really are contributing towards. So number 4 on my list is Cambodia. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe if you're new, and please leave me a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. I narrowed this list down to 6, but I do feel I need to mention 4 more near misses, highly commendeds, if you will. Cambodia's neighbour Laos is calling me. Vanuatu had the bluest water that I have ever seen and is a true tropical paradise. Egypt has more history than some entire continents, and some of the lesser known sites that you've never even heard of are more awe-inspiring than the headline attraction of some entire countries. I'm looking at you, Kuwait, and the 30 or so other countries that have no World Heritage sites in their borders. And finally, bringing us to 10 in total, is Colombia, I had an amazing time when I visited Cartagena for a couple of days, and I'd love to go back to see more of the country. Right, let's get back on script with number 5. A little more mainstream again, but I don't really care. I'm going to include it because it's gorgeous. St. Martin. Right, well, the first problem is that it's actually 2 countries. There's the French part, called St. Martin, and then there's the Dutch bit that's called St. Martin. The second problem is that some might argue that they're not even countries because they're not members of the United Nations. You know what? It's my video, my rules, I'm including it. I went there last year as a day stop on a Caribbean cruise. I've been to a few other Caribbean islands that way, but St. Martin left a real impression on me, unlike many of the others. The familiar yet contrasting Europeanness of the 2 halves of the island, juxtaposed against the tropical greens and blues, was really, really enjoyable. We did a tour of the entire island, including stops at the Dutch capital Philipsburg and the French capital Marigot, both of which were charming. We also stopped at Maho Beach, which any AV enthusiast will know is adjacent to the airport's runway. And by adjacent, I mean very, very adjacent. It's a short boat ride from Anguilla and a short flight from St. Bart's, which makes it an excellent base for exploring some of the harder to reach corners of the Caribbean. And the beaches were gorgeous, which makes it number 5 on my list, St. Martin. Finally, at position 6 on my list, it's Nicaragua. I went on a 5-country tour of Central America with Explore Worldwide, and whilst one of Nicaragua's neighbours made it onto my Bean Not Keen list, Nicaragua itself made a real impression. We passed through the capital, Managua, without even stopping. It's quite regularly flattened by earthquakes, so it has little to detain the tourist. We spent a couple of nights on Ometepe Island, where a volcano very conveniently erupted for us. We stopped in Leon, which was the colonial capital, but most impactfully, we spent a couple of nights in Granada. Granada was gorgeous. Wonderful architecture, good bars and restaurants, a fantastic lakeside setting fringed by volcanoes. What's not to like? It's the sort of place you'd want to go to for a protracted period of time, to learn Spanish perhaps, or to write a book, or perhaps to manage a travel-based YouTube channel. Nicaragua again is a developing country, so has faced some challenges in recent years. It's not the best friends with the United States for various historic reasons, but Americans are free to travel there, provided there's not a global pandemic on, of course. So number 6 is Nicaragua. There you go. I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave me a like if you did, subscribe to the channel if you're new, click the little dingy bell thingy so you're notified whenever I post a new video, and leave me a comment. I aim to try and inspire people by putting some countries on their radar that they might not otherwise be thinking of, and let me know if I've helped you out in any way, and certainly let me know if you disagree with anything that I've said. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon. Goodbye.